the town of Redemption. Falls had no redemption in it and no falls either, just a dried-up creek bed that ran through the center of the settlement like an old scar, and a collection of sun-bleached buildings that leaned against each other for structural support. The way desperate men lean on other desperate men, getting neither comfort nor stability from the arrangement. It sat in the middle of the Arizona territory like something the desert had been trying to swallow for 20 years and hadn't quite managed. Not for lack of trying. The sky above it was the particular shade of white-blue that means serious heat. Not the vivid blue of postcards and paintings, but the washed-out, merciless color of a sun that has been doing the same brutal work for months without relief and has burned the richness out of everything it touches. It was into this town, on a Thursday in the summer of 1882, that Jackson Hale rode. He came from the west, which meant he had come through the Sonoran Desert, which meant whatever he had been through in the last several days had been considerable. He was 41 years old, tall and spare, with the kind of leanness that comes from years of hard country rather than deprivation, the leanness of a man stripped to his functional core, nothing left on him that didn't serve a purpose. His face was a map of the last decade, a jaw that had been broken once and set itself slightly crooked, a thin scar running through his left eyebrow from a knife that had been trying for his eye and settled for less, skin darkened and roughened by years of outdoor living in climates that didn't care about comfort. His eyes were pale gray, almost silver in certain light, and they had the quality that eyes develop after long exposure to violence, and a flatness, a depth, a stillness that was not emptiness but rather the opposite of it, too much behind them, compressed and held still by long practice. He rode a gray horse that matched him, in disposition, experienced, unhurried, communicating a kind of quiet authority through simple presence. 2 guns on his belt, worn cross-draw. The leather of both holsters worked smooth and dark with years of use. A long rifle in the saddle scabbard, a canvas pack behind the saddle that rode low and looked heavy. The overall impression was of a man who had been prepared for a specific kind of trouble for a very long time and had not yet found an occasion serious enough to fully deploy that preparation. He stopped his horse in front of the only building in Redemption, Falls that appeared to be doing genuine business in a saloon called the Dry Well, which had the self-aware humor of a name chosen by someone who understood the establishment's relationship with its clientele. He dismounted with the careful, controlled movement of a man managing several old injuries, tied the gray to the rail and stood for a moment looking at the street in both directions, with those pale silver eyes before he went inside. It was a habit so ingrained it had long ceased to be a it movement of a man, managing several old injuries. Tied the gray to the rail, and stood for a moment looking at the street in both directions, with those pale silver eyes before he went inside. It was a habit so ingrained it had long ceased to be a conscious act of the environmental scan, the threat assessment, the noting of exits and positions in the specific quality of the stillness in a new place, which always told you something if you knew how to read it. Redemption Falls felt wrong in a way he couldn't immediately specify. The street was too quiet for the time of day. There were horses at 3 rails but no people on the boardwalks. A dog lay in the shade of the general store's awning and didn't lift its head when he rode in, which was unusual. Dogs in small desert towns maintained a professional interest in arrivals. This one looked like it had decided arrivals were no longer its concern. Jackson Hale filed all of this and went into the saloon. Inside, the Dry Well had 4 people in it, a bartender, who was polishing a glass with the mechanical persistence of a man who has been doing it for an hour without seeing the glass, 2 men at a table in the far corner, who had the specific posture of people pretending not to be watching the door, and a woman. The woman was sitting alone at the bar with a glass of whiskey in front of her that she hadn't touched, and she had the look of someone who had been sitting in exactly that position for long, enough that the position had become structural rather than chosen. She was perhaps 35, with dark red hair pulled back severely, dressed in trail clothes that had seen serious use, and there was a bruise on her left cheekbone that was 3 days old and had gone from purple to the particular yellow-green of old damage. She did not look at him when he came in, which meant she had registered him before he came through the door and had already assessed and filed him, and moved on. Jackson put his back to the bar 2 seats down from her, and ordered whiskey he didn't particularly want and looked at the room. The 2 men in the corner were looking at the woman. He had been in enough rooms and enough situations to read the dynamics of a space, the way a reader reads a page in the syntax of body language, the grammar of positioning, the punctuation of small movements. What he read in this room was, the woman was in a situation. The two men in the corner were part of the situation, and the bartender knew about it and had decided that not knowing about it was the safest available position. Jackson picked up his whiskey and looked at its contents and said, quietly enough that only the woman could hear, how many and where are the rest? The woman's hands, which had been still on the bar top, moved slightly. She looked at him for the first time, a direct, assessing look that lasted approximately 2 seconds and covered considerable ground. 5 total, she said at the same volume. 2 here, 3 outside. They've been waiting for someone who's coming from the east. She paused. I'm what they're using for leverage. Jackson nodded once. He took a sip of his whiskey. What's your name? He said. Sarah Vance, she said. And yours? Jackson Hale, he said. Something moved across her face at the name. Not recognition exactly, but the ghost of it, a reaction quickly controlled. I've heard that name, she said carefully. From who? He said. She looked at her untouched whiskey glass. From the man who's coming from the east, she said. The man they're waiting for. Jackson set his glass down very carefully on the bar top. Tell me his name, he said. She looked at him with those direct eyes. Danner Cross, she said. The name hit Jackson Hale like a fist in a place that had been hit before. His jaw tightened by a fraction. His pale eyes went somewhere briefly and came back. When is he expected? Jackson said. His voice had not changed. Tonight, Sarah said. By dark. Jackson looked at the mirror behind the bar, in which he could see the 2 men in the corner reflected, still watching, still pretending they weren't. Then we have work to do before dark, he said. The 2 men in the corner of the dry well were named Cord and Mace, and they were the kind of men that organizations like Danner Cross's kept around specifically because they had no qualities that interfered with the execution of orders, no imagination, no conscience, no independent judgment, just size and willingness and the baseline, competence required to follow simple instructions in straightforward situations. In a complicated situation, they would be lost. Jackson identified this within 30 seconds of beginning to study them, and built his understanding of the room's dynamics accordingly. The problem was the 3 men outside. Jackson couldn't see them from his position at the bar, which meant they couldn't see him, which was equal parts advantage and constraint. He needed information about their positions before he could do anything useful, and getting that information required movement, and movement in the current configuration of the room would communicate intention to Cord and Mace before he was ready for them. To have that information, he solved this problem by doing nothing for 4 minutes. He sat at the bar and drank his whiskey slowly and appeared to be a man with nowhere pressing to be, thinking about nothing in particular, which was the most effective camouflage available in a saloon. The unremarkable man passing time. In those 4 minutes, he learned the following from careful peripheral observation. Cord was left-handed, which he revealed by the way he held his beer glass and the position of his gun on his belt. Mace was right-handed but slow. There was a stiffness in his right shoulder, probably an old wound that would cost him a half-second on the draw. The bartender was not going to be a factor in either direction, and Sarah Vance, despite the bruise on her face and the untouched whiskey and the apparent stillness of someone sitting in the middle of a trap, was not afraid. Her hands were too steady. Her breathing was too controlled. This was not the stillness of paralysis. It was the stillness of someone waiting. He leaned slightly toward her. You have a weapon, he said. Not a question. Boot, she said. Small, but functional. He nodded. The bartender is going to drop that glass in approximately 30 seconds, he said. She looked at him. He said nothing further. She understood, and when the glass dropped, things would move. He did not explain how he intended to make the glass drop or why he was confident about the timing. He simply waited with the absolute patience of a man who understands that the correct preparation makes the moment manage itself. At the 28-second mark, he reached across the bar with a casual, unhurried motion and knocked the glass out of the bartender's hand. It hit the floor and shattered with a crack that filled the room. In the fraction of a second that Cord and Mace's attention moved to the sound, and the bartender's instinctive flinch, Jackson was off his stool. He crossed the room in 4 steps. Cord's hand was going for his gun, left hand, as predicted, and Jackson met the motion at its beginning rather than its end, catching the wrist, and redirecting the draw into the table, edge with enough force to make the wrist decide. The gun was someone else's problem. The gun hit the floor. cord hit the floor after it, assisted by Jackson's elbow making precise contact with a point below his left ear. Mace was standing and drawing with his right hand, the stiffness in his shoulder, costing him the half-second Jackson had anticipated. And in that half-second, Jackson's left hand, cross-draw cleared leather and the barrel of his Colt pressed against Mace's chin with a steadiness that communicated that the man holding it had been in this specific position many times before and found it unremarkable. "Put it on the table," Jackson said. Mace put it on the table. Behind the bar, Sarah had her boot knife out and its point resting against the bartender's forearm in a way that made his continued cooperation a simple anatomical matter. "The three outside," Jackson said to Mace, keeping the Colt exactly where it was, their positions. Mace had the expression of a man recalculating his situation rapidly and not finding better numbers. "Front rail," he said. "Two of them. Third one's around the back." Jackson nodded. He looked at Sarah. She had already moved to the side window and was looking out through the edge of the curtain. She held up two fingers, then pointed toward the front. Then she moved to the rear of the bar and looked through a crack in the back wall and held up one finger. "Confirmed." Jackson looked at Mace. "Call them in," he said. "Tell them you need them inside. Don't use any word or tone that isn't exactly what I would expect a man to use when he normally calls his people inside." Mace looked at him for a long moment. Then he went to the door and called his men in, and his voice was exactly what it needed to be. And all three came through the door without their hands on their weapons. And it was over quickly and without additional damage to the premises. 5 men secured. 2 hours before dark, Jackson Hale looked at Sarah Vance across the dim saloon interior, and she looked back at him. "Danner Cross is going to arrive to find his people tied up in a saloon," she said. "Yes," Jackson said. "Will that stop him?" she said. Jackson thought about Danner Cross, about the last time he had seen that face, which had been 7 years ago, in a courtroom in Tucson where Cross had walked out a free man on a technicality that had cost someone a very specific amount of money to engineer. He thought about what Cross had taken from him before the courtroom and what the courtroom had failed to return. "No," he said honestly. "It won't stop him. But it changes the conversation." He began reloading his Colt with the automatic, unhurried precision of long habit. "Now tell me everything about Danner Cross and why he's coming to Redemption Falls tonight. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." Sarah Vance's history with Danner Cross began, as histories with men like Cross usually began, with something that seemed like ordinary business and revealed itself gradually as something else entirely. She had been a surveyor's assistant in the eastern Opry, Arizona territory, a position she had earned through a combination of formal education, mathematical ability, and the willingness to do physically demanding outdoor work in conditions that discouraged most applicants regardless of gender. Her employer, a government surveyor named Aldous Prentice, had been commissioned to complete the official land survey of a 40,000-acre tract in the Sulphur Springs Valley, a survey that would determine the legal boundaries of 6 ranching families' holdings and resolve a decade-old dispute about water rights to the valley's central river access. The survey had taken 3 months in the field. Prentice had done the work with the obsessive precision that characterized his professional reputation, and the results had been clear and legally definitive. The water rights belonged to the ranching families by the original territorial grants and a series of acquisition claims filed in the previous 2 years by a land company called Crestfall Holdings were not supported by the survey evidence. Prentice had submitted his report to the Territorial Land Office in the spring of 1879. 3 weeks later, Aldous Prentice had been found dead in his hotel room in Tombstone. Cause of death officially recorded as heart failure, a diagnosis that Sarah had never accepted for the simple reason that Aldous Prentice was 52 years old and had the cardiovascular health of a man 20 years younger, as evidenced by 3 months of demanding fieldwork in the Arizona summer that would have killed an actually fragile heart. She had said this to the Tombstone sheriff and to the Territorial Marshal's office and had received in both cases the careful, sympathetic, dismissive response of institutions that have already received their instructions about a particular case. She had also, upon Prentice's death, come into possession of something that Prentice had not told her he was carrying but which she found in the hidden compartment of his field case when she was cataloging his equipment for return to the government office, a second set of survey documents, complete, detailed, duplicating the official survey data exactly, but with annotations in Prentice's precise handwriting that recorded something the official report had not included. Evidence of deliberate interference with the survey markers. Someone had moved boundary stakes, physical iron stakes, driven into the ground as reference points for the survey, by distances of between 50 and 300 feet, in ways designed to shift the documented boundaries of specific parcels. The movements were subtle enough that a less meticulous surveyor might have missed them, but Prentice had noticed the discrepancies between his initial readings and his verification measurements and had quietly documented every instance. The resulting picture, when Sarah studied the annotations over 2 sleepless nights, was of a systematic campaign to fraudulently reposition the legal boundaries of the valley's most water-rich parcels in favor of Crestfall Holdings' claims. Crestfall Holdings, as Sarah had subsequently established through careful research over the following months, was a land acquisition entity, controlled through a series of intermediary companies by Danner Cross, a man whose public profile was that of a successful cattle trader and land investor, and whose private profile, as Sarah assembled it piece by piece, was something considerably darker. Cross operated in the specific space where legal business and criminal enterprise overlap and reinforce each other. He used his legitimate holdings as cover for acquisition, strategies that range from financial manipulation to intimidation to, she was now certain, murder. Prentice was not the first person who had produced inconvenient documentation to die of untimely heart failure in Cross's operational territory. She had spent 3 years building the case and finding no one in the official structure who would receive it. Cross's political connections ran through the territorial government with the thoroughness of roots through soil, and every official channel she had tried had either ignored her documentation or, in 2 cases, resulted in the documentation being stolen, and Sarah narrowly avoiding being the next person to suffer a medical misfortune. She had spent the last year on the move, keeping the duplicate survey documents and her 3 years of additional research hidden, surviving on her own resources and the hospitality of the ranching families whose land was at stake and who had every reason to want Cross stopped and no ability to do it themselves. She had come to Redemption Falls because one of the ranching families and the Garrett family, who held the largest water-adjacent parcel in the valley, had received word that Cross himself was coming to make a final offer on their land. The kind of offer that arrives with armed men and doesn't actually require acceptance to produce a result. Sarah had come to be present for this confrontation, carrying the survey documents, without a fully developed plan for what she intended to do once she arrived, operating on the principle that being in the right place when something happens is more useful than being in the right place afterward. Cross's men had found her before she found a better position, and the bruise on her cheekbone was the result of the finding. Jackson Hale listened to all of this without interruption, sitting across from Sarah at the table that
Cord and Mace had recently vacated at gunpoint, in the quiet saloon with 5 men tied in the back room and the afternoon light going long and orange through the dirty windows. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Danner Cross killed my brother." He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without performance, as a statement of relevant fact. In Socorro, in 1875, Cross had a land dispute with my brother's mining claim, and my brother refused to sell. And 3 weeks later, my brother was dead, and Cross's people had the claim documents. He looked at his hands on the table. 7 years, he said, following Cross's operations, building the same kind of case you've been building. He looked up at her. The duplicate survey documents you're carrying, combined with what I have on Cross's Socorro operations, and 4 other cases across 2 territories, might be enough to get past his political protection. Sarah held his pale silver gaze. Outside, the sun was going further down, and Danner Cross was coming from the east, and Redemption Falls held its wrong and heavy silence around them. "Then we need to not be dead when he arrives," she said. "And we need a plan." Jackson Hale looked at the door. "We have an hour," he said. "That's enough." Jackson spent the first 15 minutes of that hour doing something that Sarah initially thought was a waste of time, and then understood was the entire foundation of everything else. He walked the town, not quickly, not obviously, but with the unhurried thoroughness of a man taking inventory of every building's position, relative to every other building, every sightline and blind spot, every door and window that opened onto the main street. He noted the water trough at the street's north end, the gap between the general store and the saddle shop that was wide, enough for a man but not a horse. the second-floor window of the rooming house above the dry. Well, that provided an elevated view of the entire street from the north approach. He noted that the church at the south end of town had a bell tower with a ladder access, visible through an open door, and he noted that the dried creek bed that bisected the settlement ran beneath the main street through a culvert large, enough for a person to move through at a crouch. He noted where the shadows would be in an hour when the sun finished its descent and what the light conditions would mean for anyone approaching from the east. Then he came back to the dry well and sat down and drew the town's layout on the back of a wanted notice he found tacked to the wall, and he and Sarah spent 15 minutes turning the drawing into a deployment plan. It was a particular kind of conversation, efficient, unsentimental, two people with complementary skills and a shared objective working through a tactical problem with the focus of people who understand that the quality of the plan is directly related to the probability of being alive at the end of the evening. Sarah had a good spatial memory and a surveyor's instinct for terrain, and she made 3 suggestions during the planning conversation that Jackson accepted immediately, without argument, which told her something useful about the man. The remaining 30 minutes they spent preparing. Jackson went to the back room where the 5 tied men were arranged, along the wall, and had a conversation with the one who appeared most susceptible to honest assessment of his situation, a younger man named Webb, who had gotten into Cross's employ 6 months ago and had been discovering ever since that the work was considerably more serious than the hiring conversation had implied. Jackson did not threaten Webb. He simply described, accurately and in specific detail, what the next several hours were likely to look like, and what Webb's situation would be when they were over, and offered him an alternative to that, a situation that required Webb's cooperation and nothing else from him that a reasonable person would find objectionable. Webb agreed with the expression of a man who has been looking for a door out of a burning room, and has just been shown one. Sarah took the rooming house second floor. Jackson took the church bell tower. Webb, under specific and clearly articulated instructions, took a position at the north end of the street, near the water trough that served a purpose in the plan that was less obvious but essential. The bartender, whose name was Orrin, and who turned out under interview to be a local man of no particular allegiance to Cross's people, just a man trying to keep his establishment undamaged and his person unshot, was given the option of staying in the back room with the tied men or going home, and he chose the second option, with a speed and gratitude that suggested he had been wanting to choose it for some time. The town settled into the silence of the prepared, a different silence from the wrong, heavy silence that had greeted Jackson on arrival. This silence had structure and intention in it. The light went golden and long across the desert flats east of Redemption Falls, painting the scrub and the red rock faces in shades that would have been beautiful if the people watching it had been in a position to experience beauty rather than threat assessment. Jackson sat in the bell tower with his long rifle across the parapet and watched the eastern road. The desert was enormous and still. Somewhere in it, coming toward this town, was a man he had been following for 7 years, a man who had taken his brother's life and his brother's claim and had walked through the institutional structure of the territory, like a person who knows that the floor is solid because he paid for it to be. Jackson watched the road. The sun went further down, and then on the eastern horizon, the dust rose. The dust cloud on the eastern road resolved itself, as Jackson watched through the long rifle's scope from the bell tower into 7 riders. He counted them twice, which was habit. He never trusted a first. Count in low light with distance involved. 7. He had planned for 5, which was the number Sarah's intelligence suggested Cross traveled with. The 2 additional riders were a variable, and variables required immediate reassessment. He pulled back from the parapet edge and thought for approximately 30 seconds, running the new arithmetic through the plan he and Sarah had built and identifying which elements needed adjustment and which held regardless of numbers. 3 elements needed adjustment. He made the adjustments in his head. fixed the revised plan in memory, and returned to the scope. Cross rode at the center of the group, which was consistent with what Jackson had learned about the man over 7 years. He kept himself surrounded and central. Never at the vanguard and never at the rear, always in the protected middle position. This was not cowardice. It was the tactical positioning of a man who understood his own value within his organization and protected it accordingly. A leader who gets himself shot in a field. Engagement is a poor leader regardless of the drama of the gesture. Cross was not a dramatic man. He was a methodical one, which in Jackson's experience was considerably more dangerous. He was visible in the scope at 200 yards and a heavyset, man of perhaps 55, with white hair cut short under a good hat and a face that, even at this distance and in this light, communicated the specific quality of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He wore a good coat, dark, and he rode a large black horse with the ease of a lifelong horseman. He was speaking to the rider on his left as they came down the road, and there was something about the relaxed, conversational quality of the interaction that told Jackson Cross was not expecting trouble. His people had sent no signal of alarm. As far as Cross knew, he was arriving at a town where 5 of his men had a woman with useful documents secured and waiting. Jackson watched them come. At 100 yards he could see Cross's face clearly in the scope, the broad, settled, unremarkable face of a successful businessman, the kind of face that appears on Chamber of Commerce portraits and Territorial Development Committee memberships, the face of civic respectability. Jackson looked at that face for a long moment. He had carried the image of it for 7 years in the specific, compressed way that you carry the face of the person responsible for an unremedied wrong. Not as a photograph, but as a hot coal, always present, always radiating. He breathed slowly. His finger was outside the trigger guard. He was not here to shoot Dana Cross in the street. He was here for something that required Cross alive and his documents intact, and a chain of evidence that could survive. Cross's legal protection. He reminded himself of this with the deliberate, conscious effort of his documents intact and a chain of evidence that could survive. Cross's legal protection. He reminded himself of this with the deliberate, conscious effort of a man who knows that the difference between justice and its opposite is sometimes a decision made in the space of one breath. Cross's riders entered the north end of Redemption Falls at a walk, the horses' hooves raising small puffs of dust from the dry street. Cross looked at the dry well, and then at the general quietness of the town with the slight frown of a man noticing a small discrepancy between what he expected and what he found. He raised a hand and the column stopped. He spoke to the rider on his right, a sharp, directed exchange. The rider dismounted and went toward the dry well's door. Jackson tracked him through the scope and then returned to Cross. At the water trough at the street's north end, Webb stood up slowly from where he had been sitting and walked toward the riders with his hands visible. This was the first element of the plan, Webb as the initial contact, delivering a specific prepared message in a specific prepared way. Cross watched Webb approach and his frown deepened. The rider who had gone to the dry well had found it empty. He was back in the street now, speaking quickly. Cross straightened in his saddle. For the first time since his arrival, something that was not relaxed calculation crossed his face. Jackson watched it from the tower and recognized it. The specific reconfiguration of a powerful man who has just understood that the environment he thought he controlled is not what he thought it was. Cross's hand moved toward the rider beside him. Instructions being issued, the riders began to spread out in the street, which was the correct tactical response, and was exactly what the plan accounted for. Jackson set down the long rifle and picked up his Colt and moved to the tower ladder. It was time to come down. The next 4 minutes in the street of Redemption Falls were the kind of 4 minutes that compress themselves into individual seconds, in memory, and expand later into something that takes much longer to carry than it did to live through. Jackson came out of the church at the south end of the street as Cross's riders were still deploying, and he walked north up the center of the street with his Colt at his side and his pale silver eyes on Cross. and the quality of his walking, unhurried, direct, with the specific gravity of a man who has been moving toward this moment for 7 years, and is not going to rush it now that it's arrived. Made 2 of Cross's riders pull up without instruction, some animal instinct recognizing a particular category of approaching threat. Cross saw him. The recognition was not immediate. 7 years changes a face, particularly 7 years of the kind Jackson Hale had lived. But it came, and when it came, it moved across Cross's face like weather moving across open country. Visible from a distance, the broad, settled features reorganized themselves around something that was not quite fear and not quite surprise, but lived in the territory between them. His right hand moved toward his coat. "Hale," he said. His voice was steady, which Jackson credited him for. A less controlled man would have let the voice go. "Danner Cross," Jackson said. He stopped 15 feet away, which was a deliberate and specific distance, close enough that the conversation was between 2 men rather than 2 positions on a street. Far enough that the geometry of the situation was clear to everyone watching. 7 years, he said, since Socorro. Cross's hand had stopped at his lapel, not completing whatever motion it had started toward. He was reading the street, counting visible threats, assessing the positions of his own men, running his own version of the arithmetic. "You have no legal standing here, Hale," Cross said. And the shift to the language of legality was itself a tell. A man reaching for the framework that had protected him before. "No badge, no warrant." "No," Jackson agreed. "None of those things." He reached into his coat with his left hand, slowly and visibly, and produced a folded document. "What I have," he said, "is a complete copy of the Sulphur Springs Valley Survey documents, including the annotations, describing the systematic repositioning of boundary markers in favor of your Crestfall Holdings claims." He held it up, combined with documented evidence from the Socorro mining claim and 4 additional cases across 2 territories. Witnessed, signed, and already dispatched by this morning's rider to a federal investigator in Tucson, who does not work within your political network. This last part was partially true. The dispatch had been one of the adjustments he'd made in his head when he counted 7 riders instead of 5, sending Webb to the telegraph office before positioning him at the water trough. Cross stared at the document. The street was very still. Sarah appeared in the second-floor window of the rooming house with the Henry rifle visible, which accounted for 3 of Cross's riders going statue still. The other 4 were looking at Jackson with the uncertain attentiveness of men waiting for a signal from their employer that their employer was currently too occupied to provide. What happened next was not what Jackson had planned for, which was the nature of plans. One of the 4 non-frozen riders, a young man with something to prove or something to lose, impossible to know which, made a decision, independent of Cross's instructions, and went for his gun. The decision took less than a second to make and considerably longer to live with, for the simple reason that Jackson Hale had been watching that particular rider's shoulder tension for the last 45 seconds, and had clocked the decision approximately 2 seconds before it was executed. The exchange that followed was brief and definitive, and cost the young rider his gun hand's use for the foreseeable future, and cost Jackson a burn across his left forearm from a shot that one of the statue-still riders fired on the acoustic trigger of hearing the first shot. Sarah's Henry took that rider's hat off cleanly, and the hat's sudden departure from his head produced in him an immediate and complete reassessment of his participation in events. The remaining 3 riders had their hands up before Jackson had finished his count. Cross sat his black horse in the center of all of this, with a stillness that was the stillness of a man whose options have just been visibly and comprehensively closed. He looked at Jackson with those reorganized features and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want, Hale?" Jackson looked at him. He thought about his brother Thomas, who had been 28 when Cross's people resolved the mining claim dispute, and had been looking forward to a life that 7 years had now been lived without him. He thought about what the courts were for and what they failed at, and what the specific purpose of the documents he was carrying actually was. "I want you in front of a federal judge," Jackson said. "I want the Garrett family and the other 5 families in the Sulphur Springs Valley to have their land back under legal documentation that can't be touched." He paused. "And I want to watch you try to buy your way out of evidence that's already in federal hands in Tucson." He looked at Cross steadily. "Dismount," he said. Cross looked at him for one more long moment. Then, with the controlled, deliberate movement of a man conserving his dignity through an indignity, he dismounted.
Getting Danner Cross to Tucson alive and with the evidence intact was, as Jackson had anticipated, an exercise in sustained vigilance across 4 days of desert riding, 4 days during which Cross's remaining capable men, reduced to 3 by the street engagement, were bound and horsed ahead of him, and Cross himself rode with his wrists tied to his saddle horn in an arrangement that was secure without being theatrical. Jackson had learned long ago that theatrical constraint invited escape attempts as a matter of dignity, while functional constraint invited passive compliance as a matter of practical calculation. Cross was a practical calculator. He rode without complaint, and with the focused interior silence of a man running through scenarios and finding none of them currently viable. Sarah rode on Cross's left, the Henry across her saddle, and she had the particular alertness of someone who has been on the receiving end of Cross's operational methods and does not intend to be again. The bruise on her cheekbone had moved further into its yellow-green phase and would be gone by the time they reached Tucson, which she noted with the pragmatic attentiveness to her own physical state that characterized everything she did. She was not a woman who made a performance of injury or of recovery. She assessed, she noted, she moved forward. Jackson found this quality consistently useful and intermittently admirable in the specific way that qualities are admirable when they are complementary to your own. On the first evening, camped in a dry wash 20 miles south of Redemption Falls, Cross spoke. He had been silent for the entire day's riding, which Jackson had not found surprising, and his speaking now had the quality of a decision, taken rather than an impulse followed. "The federal investigator you named," Cross said. "Hennessy." Jackson had not named the investigator in the street. He looked at Cross across the small fire. "You know him," Jackson said. "We've encountered each other's work," Cross said carefully, which was Cross's way of saying that. Hennessy had been investigating him, and had not yet produced results, which was information. Jackson had known but which. Cross's willingness to confirm it told him something about where. Cross was positioning himself for what came next. "He's not in anyone's network," Cross added. "Hennessy, he's inconvenient." There was a pause. "He's the right person to bring this to," Jackson said. "Yes," Cross said after a moment. "He is." Another pause. Jackson looked at the fire. "Are you telling me you want to get to Tucson?" he said. Cross looked at the fire, too. "The covenant," he started and then stopped. Jackson went very still. "What covenant?" he said. Cross looked at him and the reorganized features showed. Something new, something that looked almost like the early stages of fear, which on Danner Cross's face was more alarming than confidence had been. "The people I work for," Cross said slowly. "Not Crestfall. Above Crestfall." He paused. "I have been useful to them for 15 years. Useful people are protected. Useful people who become liabilities." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jackson looked at Sarah. She was looking at Cross with an expression that had shifted from vigilance to something more complicated. "How high does it go?" she said to Cross. Cross looked at the fire for a long moment. "Higher than a territorial judge," he said. "Higher than a senator." He looked up, which is why getting to Hennessy matters. Hennessy is the only person with both the independence and the capability to— He stopped again. "To go after what's above you," Jackson finished. Cross met his eyes. "Yes," he said. The fire crackled. The desert around them was enormous and dark and indifferent. Jackson looked at Sarah and she looked at him, and between them passed the silent, compressed communication of two people who have just understood that the problem they came into this situation to solve is considerably larger than the problem they thought they had. "Keep talking," Jackson said to Cross. "Tell us about the Covenant." And Cross talked, and the fire burned low, and the desert held its silence around them. And by the time Cross finished talking, the night was deep, and the situation was entirely different from what any of them had started with. What Danner Cross told them over the course of 3 hours beside that desert fire was, in Jackson Hale's estimation, the most structurally coherent account of large-scale corruption he had encountered in 7 years of following its consequences. Cross was not confessing out of guilt. He was a man entirely without the specific emotional architecture that guilt requires, but out of calculation, the same cold arithmetic he applied to everything. He had done the math on his situation and determined that the value of full disclosure to the right person, paired with whatever protection federal cooperation might provide, exceeded the value of continued loyalty to an organization that was in the process of deciding he had become a liability. It was not a moral decision. It was a business decision. Jackson found it more useful for being exactly that. The Covenant, as Cross described it, was not an organization in any conventional sense. It had no meetings, no membership roles, no formal structure that could be mapped and targeted. It was a set of relationships between men of substantial power and wealth who had identified territorial land, consolidation as the defining financial opportunity of the period, and had agreed, informally but durably, to coordinate their efforts toward it and share in the results. The coordination was achieved through intermediaries, men like Cross, who managed the field operations without ever being directly connected, on paper, to the principals above them. The principals, as Cross named them, were 4 in number. Harrison Beaumont, a land commissioner whose official role gave him control over territorial deed registration across 2 territories. Senator Gerald Marsh, whose committee assignments in Washington gave him oversight of the federal land office and the ability to influence territorial appointments at the highest level. Cornelius Vane, a railroad financier, whose companies stood to benefit enormously from the consolidated land parcels that the Covenant was assembling, because consolidated land meant clean right-of-way negotiations and favorable route terms that translated to hundreds of thousands of dollars in construction savings. And a 4th name that Cross was reluctant to give, and gave finally with the visible effort of a man committing to a bridge he's not sure will hold. Judge Archibald Trent, the federal circuit judge for the Arizona and New Mexico territories, whose court was the venue that any serious legal challenge to the Covenant's operations would inevitably reach. The judge. Jackson sat with that for a moment. A federal circuit judge as a principal member of the organization, whose operations he was supposed to adjudicate. It was the most elegant corruption Cross had described, not the purchase of a judge's decision in a specific case, which was crude and traceable, but the incorporation of the judge himself into the enterprise, making him not a person to be bribed, but a person with his own investment in the outcome. "Hennessy answers to Trent's circuit," Sarah said, and Jackson could hear in her voice that she had arrived at the same problem he was arriving at. Cross nodded. "Any case Hennessy builds has to be tried in Trent's court," he said. "Yes," Jackson said. He looked at the dying fire. "Unless it goes federal," Sarah said slowly. "Federal district, not circuit. Above Trent's jurisdiction." Jackson looked at her. Her dark eyes were working through something. "There's a federal district attorney in Santa Fe," she said. "His name is Caleb Marsh, no relation to the senator. He was appointed by the previous administration, before the Covenant's people had significant Washington influence. He's been in office 4 years without a major case and without being removed, which means either he's been staying small enough to avoid attention, or he's been waiting," Jackson said. Sarah looked at him. "Or he's been waiting," she agreed. Jackson thought about this. A federal district attorney in Santa Fe who might be the one person in the official structure, not already inside the web. It was a long shot assembled from inference and hope, which was the worst kind of operational foundation. It was also at this moment the only foundation available. "We need to get to Santa Fe," Jackson said. "After Tucson?" Sarah asked. "Instead of Tucson," Jackson said. He looked at Cross. "Hennessy is compromised by Trent's oversight. Marsh and Santa Fe is the move." Cross considered this with his calculating eyes. "Santa Fe is 400 miles, he said. Through country where the Covenant has people watching the roads. Yes, Jackson said. Can you get us through it? Sarah said to Cross. Cross looked at them both. His wrong position had just become a slightly less wrong one, and he recognized it. I know the routes they watch, he said. And the ones they don't. Jackson nodded once. Then you're more valuable alive and cooperative than any alternative, he said. He put out the fire. We leave before dawn. The route Cross chose from the Arizona desert toward Santa Fe took them north first, which felt wrong directionally and was right tactically. It kept them away from the main east-west road that the Covenant's watchers used as their primary surveillance corridor, the logical route between Tucson and Santa Fe that a person making this particular journey would be expected to take. Instead, they moved up through the high country of the White Mountains, where the terrain was pine forest and rocky ridgeline, and the air was 20 degrees cooler than the desert below, and where the sparse population and the difficulty of the ground meant that organized surveillance was impractical. Cross guided them through this country with the specific, detailed knowledge of a man who had used these back routes for his own operational purposes and now found the knowledge repurposed against its original employer. Jackson watched Cross during these navigation decisions with sustained attention. Every route choice was a potential delivery, a path that led somewhere. Cross's people would be waiting, a detour that served a purpose other than the stated one. But Cross's choices, as Jackson verified them against his own knowledge of the terrain and Sarah's surveyor's instinct for geographic logic, were consistently defensible. He was navigating with the honest pragmatism of a man who has decided that his value to the people currently holding his reins is best maintained by being genuinely useful. He pointed out 2 positions on the second day that Jackson would not have identified as watched without the tip, positions from which, Cross said, Covenant people monitored the northern approach routes during active operations. They detoured around both, adding 2 hours to the day's travel. The 3 remaining bound riders were a sustained logistical problem. Jackson had considered releasing them at Redemption Falls and decided against it. Freed men with horses and a communication network available would have the Covenant's people informed of his direction and composition before he'd covered 10 miles. He had considered leaving them secured in Redemption Falls, in the care of the bartender Orrin, which would have been cleaner, and had decided against it for the same reason. Orrin was a decent man who ran a saloon and was not equipped to manage 3 dangerous men for the days it would take before any official response could reach him. So the 3 rode ahead on a lead rope, bound and watchful, and Jackson managed them with the combination of unambiguous capability and clear expectation of behavior that kept them functional and non-aggressive. One of them, the oldest, a weathered man named Garrett, who bore no relation to the ranching family and had been in Cross's employ for 9 years, had developed the specific philosophy of the long-term hired man, who has finally encountered a situation that his employer cannot resolve, and had settled into a kind of resigned cooperation that was more valuable than defiance would have been. On the 3rd night of the mountain passage, camped on a pine ridge with the desert, visible as a distant warm-colored plain, far below to the south, Sarah sat beside Jackson on watch while Cross and the 3 bound men slept, and they talked in the low, careful voices of people covering ground that needed covering. What happens when we get to Santa Fe? Sarah said. It was not an anxious question. It was the question of someone planning ahead. We find Marsh, Jackson said. We present the survey documents and Cross's testimony and my documentation of the Socorro case and the others. We ask him to open a federal district investigation. And if Marsh is compromised too, Sarah said. Jackson looked at the distant desert below. Then we go to a newspaper, he said. A territorial paper with national connections. If the official structure is completely closed, the last option is public record. Sarah was quiet for a moment. The Covenant will move against Cross the moment they know he's cooperating, she said. They'll move against both of us, Jackson said. They'll have been moving against me for 7 years in the form of institutional obstruction and evidence suppression. Moving openly is different from that. It means they're exposed. It means they're dangerous in a different way, Sarah said. Yes, Jackson said. A cornered thing with resources and political connections is the most dangerous version of it. He looked at the stars. which at this altitude were extraordinarily clear and numerous. "But a thing that's still hiding is worse," he said, "because it keeps working." Sarah followed his gaze to the sky. "Your brother," she said, not a question. "Thomas," Jackson said, 28. A pause. "He wanted to build something," Jackson said. "The claim, the mining operation. He had plans." His voice was level throughout, which caused something that didn't show. "Cross took the plans along with everything else." Sarah looked at him. In the thin moonlight, her face was serious and still. "We're going to get there," she said. "To Santa Fe, to Marsh, to the end of this." Jackson looked at her. He didn't agree with easy confidence, and she didn't seem to expect him to. What he said was, "We're going to try until we can't." She held his gaze. "That's enough," she said, and somehow from her, in this particular moment, it was. The northern pass through the White, mountains that Cross had identified as the safest. Crossing onto the eastern plateau was a narrow gap, in the ridgeline at approximately 9,000 feet. Elevation, approached by a switchback trail that gained 3,000 feet of altitude and 4 miles and required the horses to be led rather than ridden for the upper half of the ascent. It was, Cross assured them, unwatched, too remote, too difficult, and not on any route that the Covenant's people considered worth monitoring because no one in their right mind used it for anything except the most desperate avoidance of the main roads. Jackson noted the implicit compliment and kept his assessment of the pass, independent of Cross's endorsement. The first 3 switchbacks were straightforward, brutal on the legs and lungs. At that altitude, the thin air making the climb. Feel half again as hard as the same. Slope at lower elevation, but structurally uncomplicated. The trail was solid rock for most of its width, with loose shale at the edges that required care. The horses moved up steadily with the patient, breath-conserving effort of experienced mountain horses. Jackson led his gray, and the gray followed with the cooperative competence of an animal that has been in difficult terrain before and knows that the human at the lead. Rope is a reliable guide. The ambush was at the 4th switchback. It had been placed there by someone who understood mountain travel and understood that the 4th switchback was the point of maximum effort and minimum attention. The place where every person on a steep mountain trail is focused, primarily on the next step and secondarily on everything else. It was also the narrowest point on the trail, where the path crossed a rock ledge, barely wide enough for a horse with a man beside it, with a drop of 200 feet on the outer edge and a vertical rock face on the inner, which meant there was no lateral movement available and retreat. Required turning in a space that was not large enough to turn in easily. 2 men appeared on the rock face above, appeared with the specific suddenness of people who had been there for some time already and had chosen their moment. A third materialized from behind a boulder at the trail's inner edge 30 feet ahead. Jackson's read of the situation completed itself in approximately 1 second. 3 visible, probably more above or below, positioned for a box rather than a simple confrontation, which meant capture rather than immediate killing was the intent. Someone wanted Cross back and wanted whatever documents were with him, and wanted the people carrying them in a position where leverage was possible. He released the gray's lead rope and pushed the horse toward the boulder. Position ahead, which was counterintuitive and worked for exactly that reason. The horse going forward toward the third man created a problem that required immediate physical management, and in the 2 seconds that management took, Jackson went left against the inner rock face and moved forward fast, along its surface with the specific technique of a man who has thought carefully about what to do when the open ground is unavailable. One of the men above fired, and the shot hit where Jackson had been standing, the sound enormous and doubling against the rock faces. Sarah, behind him, had gone flat against the trail surface with the Henry already moving. The second man above was acquiring his shot, and Sarah took away the acquisition by putting a round 6 inches above his head, not trying for the man but for the rock face beside him. And the fragmenting rock achieved a more complicated effect than a direct hit would have. The man flinched, and his shot went wide, and he lost his position on the face, catching himself 3 feet lower with the expression of someone reconsidering their morning's choices. The third man had the horse's bridle and was fighting the animal, which was not cooperating, and Jackson came around the boulder and ended that. engagement with one economical application of a rifle stock to the back of the man's knee and caught the horse's bridle himself as the man went down. Cross, to Jackson's left, had used the eruption of action to pull his bound wrists up over his saddle horn, a movement that required the saddle to come off the horse, which it had, and Cross was now standing on the trail with the saddle between his bound wrists, and his expression was the controlled, calculating one of a man deciding whether his calculation had changed. Jackson looked at him. "Has it changed?" Jackson said directly. Cross looked at the downed man and the repositioned Sarah and the rock face above where the second shooter was still renegotiating his relationship with the vertical surface. "No," Cross said after a moment. "It hasn't changed." Jackson looked at him for one more beat and then turned back to the trail problem. Above them on the rock face there were still people, and the pass was still 400 feet above, and the only direction available was forward. He began moving forward. Santa Fe received them on the 8th day as it received most arrivals from difficult country, with the specific indifference of a city that has seen too many road-worn people to find any particular road-worn person remarkable. They came in from the northwest, which was not the expected approach for anyone coming from Arizona, and they came in split across 2 entries. Cross and the 3 bound men with Sarah through the northern road, Jackson through the western road on a 30-minute offset that ensured they were never simultaneously visible on the same approach. The bound men had been partially freed for the entry, hands in front rather than behind, coats arranged to cover the remaining restraints, managed with the specific social engineering of making a convoy of prisoners look like a group of road-tired travelers. The federal district attorney's office was in a 2-story brick building off the plaza that had the look of a government building everywhere, the particular institutional beige of authority, operating on a budget, windows with plain shutters, a door that was solid and functional rather than welcoming. Jackson went in alone first, which was also the plan. Cross and Sarah and the 3 bound men waited in a rented stable 2 streets over while Jackson made the initial contact, because if Caleb Marsh turned out to be compromised, having everyone in the same location would be catastrophically wrong, and having them separated preserved options. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with the fresh-out-of-law-school energy of someone who still believed in the institution he was working for, which Jackson found either encouraging or naive depending on what Marsh turned out to be. He asked for Marsh by name and stated his business as federal, land fraud evidence in the Arizona territory, and the clerk's eyes went from routine to genuinely attentive, in a way that was itself informative. This was not a subject that produced routine reactions in this office. He was shown to a waiting room and waited for 12 minutes, which he timed by the wall clock and spent reading the room for the kind of contextual information that offices provide about the people who run them. Caleb Marsh was 40, lean, with the look of a man who had been doing difficult work in inadequate conditions for long enough that difficulty and inadequacy had become his baseline operating environment rather than a complaint. He had intelligent dark eyes and a direct manner of address that skipped the performative pleasantries that most official meetings began with. He came into the waiting room, looked at Jackson, and said, "Tell me what you have." Jackson liked him immediately, which he noted and discounted. Liking was not the same as reliable. He began talking. Marsh listened for 20 minutes without interrupting, and the quality of his listening was the quality of a man building a structure in his head. As the information arrived, not simply recording it but integrating it, testing it against what he already knew, locating the connections. At 2 points he asked questions, sharp, specific, targeted questions that told Jackson he had existing knowledge of parts of what was being described, which was both confirming and interesting. When Jackson finished, Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been building a case around Crestfall Holdings for 14 months. He said it flatly without drama. "I have documented the financial trail from Crestfall to 3 other land entities, and I have evidence of 3 fraudulent deed transactions in my jurisdiction." He paused. "I have not been able to get above Crestfall. I have not been able to identify the principals." He looked at Jackson steadily. "You have Danner Cross willing to testify," Jackson said, "against the principals." Marsh looked at his desk for a moment. Then he stood up. "Where is he?" he said. "2 streets over," Jackson said. "In a stable?" Marsh looked at him. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been pushing against a wall for 14 months and has just been told there is a door. "Take me there," he said. The meeting in the stable between Caleb Marsh, Danner Cross, and the combined documentation that Jackson and Sarah had assembled lasted 4 hours and produced, by its end, the most complete picture of the Covenant's structure and operations that any single room had yet contained. Marsh had brought a deputy and a court recorder, which told Jackson something about how seriously he had taken the initial conversation. He had come prepared to take sworn testimony, which meant he had already made a decision about what he was hearing before he heard all of it. Cross was methodical and specific in his testimony. He had made his calculation and was executing against it with the same professionalism he brought to everything else. He named names, provided dates, described the mechanism by which Crestfall's fraudulent deed transactions had been processed through the land. Commission Office, with Beaumont's facilitation, described the senator's role in protecting the operation at the federal level, described Vane's financial arrangements and, after a long pause that Marsh waited out without pressure, described Judge Trent's involvement with the flat. Careful specificity of a man dismantling something he once helped build. Marsh listened to all of it with his recorder taking everything down and his intelligent dark eyes doing the structural integration that characterized his listening. Twice he cross-referenced Cross's testimony against documents he had brought from his own office, documents that confirmed specific financial transactions Cross described, the confirmation working in both directions, validating Cross's account and validating Marsh's prior evidence. By the 3rd hour, the confirmation density was high enough that Marsh's expression had moved from carefully controlled neutrality to something that was close to the specific grim satisfaction of a man watching a case become solid. It was Sarah who raised the question that Jackson had been holding for an hour. "Trent," she said, "his court is the natural venue for a case of this scope. How do you go around him?" Marsh looked at her. "Federal district supersedes circuit," he said. "My office can proceed at district level. If the federal component of the charges is sufficient, which in this case it clearly is, fraudulent use of Federal Land Commission authority, bribery of a federal senator, interstate fraud." He paused. "Trent can try to intervene, but he cannot reassign a federal district case to his own court without going through the appellate process, which takes time and requires argumentation that would itself expose his interest in the outcome." He paused again. "What he can do is warn Beaumont and Marsh and Vane that the case is building, which gives them time to prepare a defense, move assets, or disappear." Jackson looked at him. "How long before they know?" he said. "If I file federal charges today," Marsh said, "Trent knows within 48 hours. His clerk is the mechanism. I've suspected it for a year, without being able to prove it." "Then you have 48 hours, Sarah said. Marsh nodded once. "To get federal marshals to 4 locations simultaneously," he said. "Beaumont in Tucson. The senator in Washington. I'll need Justice Department coordination for that, which I can get if the evidence package is complete. Vane in Denver, Trent himself." He looked at Jackson. "And it needs to be airtight before I file. Not 90%, completely airtight. Because once the filing is done and the 48 hours starts, there is no adjustment available." Jackson looked at the stacks of documents on the stable floor between them. "What do you still need?" he said. Marsh looked at the documents. "The survey annotations authenticated by a second surveyor," he said. Cross's testimony corroborated on the specific financial transactions by an independent financial record. He paused. "And a statement from the Garrett family and the other affected landholders in the Sulphur, Springs Valley, sworn and notarized." He looked at Sarah. "You can authenticate the survey annotations," he said. It was not quite a question. "I was Prentice's assistant," she said. "I can authenticate every measurement in those documents and explain exactly how the markers were moved and what the effect was on the legal boundaries." Marsh nodded. He looked at Jackson. "I need 3 days," he said. "Give me 3 days to get the corroborating financial records from my existing case files and to get sworn statements from the Valley landholders by telegraph." Jackson calculated the risk of 3 days, against the alternative of going in without the evidence being airtight. 3 days, he said. It was the hardest 2 words he had said in a long time. The 3 days that Marsh needed were the longest 3 days Jackson Hale had lived through since the night in Socorro, and the night in Socorro had been the longest night of his life, which set a high threshold. The difficulty was not activity. They were busy throughout, working with Marsh's deputy to organize and catalog the documentation, with Sarah spending 6 hours on the second day writing the formal authentication of the survey annotations in the precise technical language that legal proceedings required, with Jackson providing sworn statements about the Socorro case and the 4 subsequent cases he had documented across 2 territories. The difficulty was the quality of waiting that underlay all of the activity and the specific, corrosive vigilance of people who know that a clock is running and cannot see the clock. Cross was held in a secure room in Marsh's building, not a jail cell, which would have been visible and informative to anyone watching the federal building, but a second-floor office with a lock and a deputy outside it and a window that looked onto an interior courtyard. Cross spent his time there with the contained, interior composure of a man who has made his decision and is waiting to see what it produces, and Jackson checked on him twice a day, and the conversations were brief and functional, and devoid of anything that looked like the relationship it was technically not. The Covenant's people were in Santa Fe. Jackson was certain of this. By the end of the first day, having spent several hours moving through the city with the specific attentiveness of a man reading a place for surveillance, and having identified 3 people whose presence in 3 different locations at 3 different times of day was not consistent with legitimate business, but was consistent with coverage of a building of interest. They were watching Marsh's office. They did not yet appear to know about the stable meeting or about Cross's presence in the building, which meant they were operating on suspicion rather than confirmed. Intelligence? Suspicion was bad, but it was manageable, whereas confirmed intelligence would have produced a different and more aggressive response. The question was how long suspicion stayed suspicion before it became something else. On the second night, one of the watchers followed Sarah from the federal building to the boarding house where she was staying, and Sarah noticed him 4 blocks into the follow and did what her 3 years of mobile survival had trained her to do. She changed her route 3 times, not evasively but casually, the natural route variations of a person familiar with a city's geography, and she stopped twice in well-lit, populated locations for legitimate-seeming purposes, and by the 4th block the watcher had either lost interest or lost her, and she arrived at the boarding house through the back entrance with her pulse running but her expression calm, and her notes from the day's work tucked securely inside her coat. She told Jackson about it at their morning meeting on the 3rd day, and he listened and said, "Today, Marsh has to file today whether the corroborating financial records are complete or not." Sarah looked at him. "Is it enough without them?" she said. "It's enough," Jackson said. "It's not everything Marsh wanted, but it's enough to hold in court, and it's better than waiting for the Covenant to confirm what they're suspecting." He went to Marsh's office, and they had the conversation that needed to have, and Marsh looked at the assembled documentation for a long moment, with the expression of a man accepting a case that is 94% of what he wanted instead of 100. "File it," Jackson said. "Today, now." Marsh looked at him. He looked at the documents. He looked out his window at the plaza. He picked up his pen. "I'm filing," he said, and he began to write, and the 48-hour clock that would determine whether the Covenant had time to run or time to be caught began. The Jemez Mountains were 3 hours north of Santa Fe on a good road and longer on the road Trent would have taken, which was not the good road, but the one that didn't. Passed through 3 towns where a recognized federal judge fleeing a warrant might be noted. Jackson and Sarah rode hard and reached the mountain property, a solid log structure set in a pine clearing with a view of the canyon below, 40 minutes ahead of any reasonable estimate of Trent's arrival, which was the margin that made everything else possible. They took positions that covered the single road approach and waited with the specific quality of waiting. That is the final version of all the waiting that has come before it, compressed and total, nothing extraneous, everything reduced to the next moment and the one after. The pines were tall around them, and the mountain air was cold and clean and smelled of resin and distance. Jackson looked at the road and thought about Thomas and thought about Elena and Rosa. Callahan from a story that was not his, but was the story he had been given instead of his own. The story that had made him what he was for 7 years, and he thought about whether the end of this particular road meant the beginning of something else or simply the end of a long walk that had been the definition of his life for longer than anything before it. He did not have an answer. He thought he might not need one yet. Trent came an hour after they arrived. He came alone, which was unexpected, which meant either his resources had failed to provide company, or he had decided that alone was faster. He was a large man of 60, with white hair and a judge's bearing that persisted even in flight, even on a mountain road in the early dark with a warrant behind him. He reined his horse when he saw them on the road, Jackson standing in the center of it, Sarah off to the left with the Henry, and the bearing shifted slightly, the judicial authority encountering something that did not respond to authority. "Hale," he said. He knew the name. Of course he did. He was a principal of the Covenant, and Jackson Hale had been moving through the Covenant's operations for 7 years. "Judge Trent," Jackson said. He did not reach for his gun. He stood in the middle of the road with his hands at his sides and his pale, silver eyes on the judge and said, "You know what I have. You know what Marsh has. You know what Cross testified to." A pause. "There's nowhere this road goes that changes any of that." Trent sat his horse and looked at him for a long moment. The mountain was very quiet. The last light was going orange and long through the pines. Something moved across the judge's face. The complicated, private passage of a man arriving at an understanding that has been approaching for a long time and has finally closed the distance. 7 years, Trent said. It was almost reflective. "You've been following us for 7 years. "Following the damage," Jackson said. "Your operations left a great deal of it." Another pause. "My brother was 28, he said. It was the same thing he had said to Sarah on the mountain ridge, in the same flat, factual tone. Trent looked at him. Something in the judicial face shifted toward something older and less defended. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his coat, slowly, and Jackson's hand moved to the Colt, and stopped when he saw what Trent was producing, which was not a weapon but a folded paper. He held it out. Jackson walked forward and took it. He unfolded it and looked at it in the failing light. It was a list of names, long, 40, perhaps 50 entries. "Everyone who worked for the Covenant in my jurisdiction," Trent said. "Field people, clerks, bought officials, all of them. I've been keeping it for 3 years. He paused. "I don't know why. Perhaps I knew this day was coming." Jackson looked at the list and then at Trent. "Dismount," he said. Trent dismounted. Sarah came forward with the cord, and Trent submitted to it with the contained, exhausted dignity of a man who has arrived at the terminus of a long journey and is not surprised by what he finds there. They rode back to Santa Fe through the dark, and the pines closed behind them, and the mountains held their silence, and ahead of them the lights of the city were beginning to show in the valley below, small and scattered and ordinary and permanent. In the way that human settlements are permanent, the stubborn continuance of people making their lives in difficult country regardless of what the difficult country and the difficult men do to them. Jackson rode beside Trent and said nothing for a long time. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "Thomas, just the name. As a notation, as an acknowledgement, as the small ceremony of a man who has carried something long and heavy and has now set it down and is marking the moment of setting it down because it deserves to be marked." Sarah, riding on his other side, heard it and said nothing and rode, close enough that their stirrups were almost touching, which was a kind of company that required no words and offered more than most words would have managed. In Santa Fe, Caleb Marsh was at his desk at 10 o'clock at night, which surprised no one who had spent any time with him, and he looked at Trent and the list and Jackson and Sarah and the documentation of the previous 8 days and said, with the flat, direct, entirely genuine expression of a man arriving at a moment he has been working toward for 14 months. "We have everything." Jackson looked at him. "Then use it," he said. The trial of the Covenant's 4 principals, conducted in federal district court, bypassing the circuit that Trent himself had corrupted, presided over by a judge who had been specifically appointed from outside. The territorial network ran for 3 weeks and produced convictions on 47 counts of fraud, bribery, land theft, and conspiracy. Senator Marsh resigned from his Senate seat on the first day of trial. Beaumont was sentenced to 20 years. Vane's financial empire was attached, and his assets used in part to compensate the displaced, families across 2 territories. Trent received a reduced sentence in exchange for the list, which produced 38 additional prosecutions over the following 2 years. The Garrett family and the 5 other Sulphur Springs Valley families received their land back under clean,